Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Barbara Harris, and I've had the pleasure of, there you are over there, I've had the pleasure of meeting Barbara and talking to her a couple of times before tonight, and I've really discovered that Barbara is accomplished in so many ways. She has a BSW and MSW. SW stands for social work, PhD, all achieved since she turned 40, okay? So that's amazing, and at that point, she had only grade 8. And the reason she had only grade 8 will become clear, I'm sure, as she's talking to us at that point, but I wanted to say that recently Barbara has also won the Courage to Come Back Award. So that's something that's amazing. It's hard in 7 minutes to share a lot, I know, but you are going to share some of your experience with post-traumatic stress disorder due to childhood trauma, as well as depression, anxiety, and addiction. And then you're going to tell us, Barbara, what you've learned about structural stigma in your life, and as an academic and as a person with lived experience. So please welcome Dr. Barbara Harris.
You're going to make me cry telling all that. Thank you. You probably read the little blurb they have about us. I suppose they have that in the paperwork you have. I haven't even seen it. But I always say the quick and dirty story is that, yes, I grew up in a very traumatic environment as a child, and I ran away at 13. And I was completely frozen when I left. I was so traumatized that I was just completely frozen because I don't know. And then after I left, it took me a long time to unthaw. And as I started to unthaw, needless to say, all my trauma, the fear and all these things that were paralyzing me became so intense that naturally I started using chemicals and alcohol to try and medicate that. Not very successfully, I might add, but nonetheless, I tried for quite a few years before I actually quit drinking. I quit drinking at 31, and it took me almost 10 years. It took me 9 years to get up enough courage to try and go get a life. Anyway, I was looking at the Canadian Mental Health Association's website when I was invited to come here and speak, and I was just sort of perusing the website, and I noticed one little thing, which was that they highlighted in much of the research that's on the website. It's a fantastic resource, but one of the things I noticed was that strongly highlighted was that structural stigma is really prevalent in the areas of education, employment, housing, and even in relation to the issue of safety for people who have mental health issues. And of course, safety has many meanings. I'm sure there's people here that know what some of those are. But when I was sort of noticing that, I thought, well, I actually was going to do a completely different talk, but then I thought, well, considering I spent 13 years in academia, I suppose I could talk about what it was like being in that system. And I went to university for 13 years. I also worked at UBC for 9 years teaching and doing program coordination and development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of have experience of being an Aboriginal woman with mental health issues in the university system from 1994 until 2009. I spent quite a few years in that system. So I thought I would just briefly touch on sort of my reflections on being in the trenches of academia as a person, as an Aboriginal woman with mental health issues. All right? So one of the things I was thinking about is how I had to learn to advocate for myself all through those university years, whether I was as a faculty or as a student. And when you try to advocate for yourself and you have a mental health issue, this presents a problem because it's not something generally visible. And, I was doing to protect myself, when I started at UBC, my BSW degree, I actually went to the disability office and said, I have a disability and I need to be registered here just in case. I need to be registered. And they looked at me and they said, well, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, I have mental health issues. And they said, well, you're going to need a doctor's letter. we're going to need some verification that you have these issues. Okay, fine, whatever. I was very fortunate that in all my years of university, I only ever needed to use them once. But thank heaven that I was actually registered there, and I was able to go there and get the letter I needed to get an extension on a course that I was in. But I had to go through a lot of rigmarole to get registered, I will admit. And my reflection about it is that, as a community, I think of, as part of a community of people with mental health issues, I think that advocacy for us means ensuring that departments like that are meeting our needs. I think that's part of the advocacy we need to do, to speak to the institution and work at having things in place for us. We have to do that. I also determined that being super well informed of policies, services, and resources was really critical, because that's what allowed me to hold them responsible for services. And I like to give that example because I had a lady that came into my office who has a mental health issue and was in a program in UBC, and they basically threw her out of the program because they tried to throw her out of the program because she was taking too long. She was taking longer than she was supposed to take. And I spent a couple of sessions with her, educating her on why she could not allow that to happen and how she could go about it. And I took her to the UBC website, and they actually have on their website, on their disability page, they actually have a commitment to people with disabilities to help them succeed. And I started there with her. I said, this is why you cannot let them get away with this. And this is why, for all intents and purposes, you have a human rights case if they try to throw you out. So it took her quite a bit of work to be able to wrap her head around her right as a person with disabilities within that institution. But that's what we worked on so that she could do that. And she was able to actually carry on with her program because I told her exactly what to say to who and where. And so she did that. And I mean, I had the advantage of having been a student in that system and also teaching in that system for many years. So I knew both sides of the fence, which was a real advantage. So I was able to share that with her. I also learned that no matter how educated you are, having a mental illness means struggling for credibility. And at times, it is simply because you have a mental illness that somehow or another your credibility just, might not quite be there for the person in front of you. Like they'll question your credibility. And there was various things related to that. One of the things that I would do in order to cope with my own fear of being questioned in terms of my credibility of my voice or whatever I had to say was that I would always make sure I was over-prepared. Right from before I started school, I was so paranoid that I would be over-prepared for everything. I was the person that was in every office asking every question, making sure I knew every fact, every point, every bit of information that I needed to know in order to be able to get through a program without missing a single little thing, a single policy, or a single issue, or a single assignment, or a single whatever it was. It didn't matter what it was. I was always over-prepared, and I would write stuff down. I had lists, everything, whatever I needed, so that there was absolutely no way they could catch me, or hook me, or somehow fail me, whatever it was. That's the way I did it. I was always well-prepared, over-prepared. The other thing, too, and this is true, I think, because we're talking about stigma, you already all know this, that the whole business of exposing my situation it's always very risky. It doesn't matter what room you're sitting in. And the other thing is that even once you expose it and, some of that real subtle kinds of discrimination start to happen, it can be very difficult to prove and very, very difficult to call people account on that. That's what I've learned anyway. And I always like to give this example. When I was at UBC and I taught there for 9 years, I had another person who was in exactly the same position as me. I was a lecturer and a program coordinator. She was a lecturer and a program coordinator. She'd been there much longer than me. Okay, fair enough. But nonetheless, we both had exactly the same type of appointment. And she used to call me and email me and say, "Where were you at that meeting? How come you weren't there?" She would always be trying to call me to account, and for some reason, she felt that she had the authority and whatever, just that it was okay for her to be keeping an eye on me. I never, ever replied to her on those counts. I'm sorry. It didn't even dignify a response. Yeah, anyway. Now, the other thing about this is that, okay, I did not dignify her with a response, but how could I hold her accountable? How could I possibly hold her accountable? She was actually best friends with, the people who were in power and authority over me. And there was absolutely no way I could go to them and say, excuse me, can you please talk to this employee and explain to her that I do not answer to her? Could you do that? I mean, I chose not to do that. But, really, if we had the systems in place to be able to deal with that kind of stigma, that is really important. How do we create that? So it's just a little note, because it's very subtle sometimes. To me, it's blatant. But to other people, they're looking, oh, what do you, what's your problem, Anyway, I did also learn that given that this kind of goes on around us all the time, it's really important to know who your allies are and to really be aware of who is the wolf, be careful and try and figure out who is the wolf in sheep clothing, because they're everywhere. I'm sorry, but they're everywhere. And I don't want to make people paranoid, but that is the truth. I had people who made out like they were total supporters of me, and then they would just say the most idiotic things that were all about stigma and some kind of negative thing towards me, just totally disrespectful, and they had no even clue of how disrespectful they were being. Anyway, the thing I also realized in all my years as a person with mental health issues and a person who works with mental health issues is that we all tend to know. Sometimes we can't, it's not tangible, but we know. We can feel it. We can feel it in our gut when people are sincere. We can feel it in our gut when they're just there because they're trying to catch a paycheck, whatever it is. And it's really important to trust your gut, because when you've been dealing with stigma for a very long time, you know it deep in your bones when you see it. You know that that's a zebra. You know those stripes, So it's really important, I think, to trust our inner voice. And, to make sure that it's our wise voice talking, But, it's important to listen to that voice and to learn to trust ourselves and to trust our gut. Ultimately, I really believe that education is power, and it does give us the power to hold people accountable. And sometimes the education we're getting is from that little voice inside of us, and sometimes it is knowing the policy that's on the page. But that's what allows us to hold people accountable. And, just to not be afraid. My MO all through my education system was I'm going to stay under the radar, because when I was a little girl, if I didn't stay under the radar, even if I was under the radar, I might get punched in the head. But as an adult, that became my MO. I got to stay under the radar. That is how I survived the education system. But I also knew when I saw the zebra, and I would walk the other way. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful at all. Thank you very much for having me.
We're going to be coming up, all of us up to the stage. Now, this is a time that people are going to be coming around to collect your questions. We have time for a few questions, but Barbara, I want to thank you and to say that this is the toughest, isn't it, the structural stigma, and that it made me grateful that we're all here together, because you can't do it by yourself, is a message I heard from you. So this is the beginning of changing structures together.